Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Angela Richardson, Supervisor of the Information Resources Center here at the Illinois Math and Science Academy. Thank you so much for joining us today for our first out of a three-part webinar series, Empowering Educators to Lead the Change for Equity and Excellence. Today, our speaker is Dr. Adrienne Coleman, Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the Illinois Math and Science Academy. Dr. Coleman attended Illinois State University, where she received her master's degree in public health and in higher education. She also taught public health and social justice courses at Rutgers University in New Jersey. Today, Dr. Coleman's presentation titled A Path Forward, Advancing Educational Equity and Excellence will provide you with an understanding of educational equity, share tools to assist educational institutions in drafting data-informed equity and excellence policies and plans, as well as provide a framework to score and measure progress in advancing equity. Without further delay, I'd like to introduce Dr. Adrienne Coleman.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I want to start off with a spoken word piece called The Dream, Part 2. I wasn't there in 1960 when students all over the South sat in at lunch counters demanding equal rights. I wasn't there in 1962 when men and women in Albany straightened their backs up, recognizing that a man can't ride your back unless it's bent. I wasn't there in 1963 when a group of people aroused the nation and brought into being the Civil Rights Bill and movement. It was his dream, but it's my reality. I wasn't there on August 28th, 1963, when Dr. King shared a dream that he had about a day when little Black boys and little Black girls could live in unity with little white boys and little white girls as sisters and brothers. That was his dream, that this be my reality. See, I wasn't even born until 8 years after Dr. King shared his great dream with the nation. I didn't have to endure separate drinking fountains, separate bathrooms, or eat in the back of a restaurant because of the color of my skin. I've never had to participate in a boycott or sit in for my freedom. I've had no living room civil rights meeting, no water hose knocking me down, no biting dogs tearing at my legs, nor any cocktail bombs being thrown into my home in my quest for equal rights. And that was his dream, that this be my reality. You see, I am the benefactor of a dream spoken for, fought for, suffered for, prayed for, and died for. And the journey is still underway. There's so much work still left to do. Yes, we own homes, build businesses, experience fame, and coexist together as brothers and sisters because of the dream, part 1. And now it's time for the dream, part 2. Recognizing as Blacks, whites, Latinos, Asians, Jews and Gentiles, Muslims, Protestants and Catholics, that though there are many barriers that we've broken through, we still have hungry mothers, homeless fathers, and undereducated children. In this dream, there's no playing small and no sleeping on the job, because like me, there's an unborn child out there who's counting on each and every one of you. This dream requires you to wake up, stand up, speak up, hurry up, catch up, stay prayed up, and oh, you definitely must show up. And in your own brilliance, do whatever you can do, because Dr. King handled the dream, part 1, and now it's up to you and I to handle the dream, part 2. See, Dr. King, he made sure that we had equality, right? But we have to continue his legacy with equity. We have so many students who are undereducated. We have so many inequities that exist in our educational systems. And today we're gonna talk about what that looks like. We're gonna talk about being equity-minded. We're gonna talk about how to truly advance this work in our own educational institutions. And with that, I'm gonna begin sharing my screen. So Angie introduced me, but now I wanna really start off by sharing with you who I am, how I show up in this space, how I show up in the world, the lens through which I view the world and the lens through which I problem solve. I want to share my selfie. When it comes to my race and ethnicity, I identify as Black and African American. And in this particular identity, I feel very much oppressed in our society. When it comes to my biological sex, I identify as female. And in this identity, I feel very much oppressed in our society. When it comes to my sexual orientation, I identify as heterosexual. And in this particular identity, I feel very much privileged in our society. When it comes to my gender, I identify as cisgender, meaning I identify with the gender of my biological sex. I was born female and identify as such. And my pronouns are she, her, and hers. And in this particular identity, I feel very much privileged in our society. When it comes to my religion and spirituality, I identify as Christian. I was born and raised in the Catholic faith. And in this particular identity, I feel very much privileged in our society. When it comes to my age, my class, and my ability, I identify as middle-aged and middle class, as well as able-bodied and emotionally well. And in these identities, I feel very much privileged in our society. Some of my values and beliefs, I believe in equity, I believe in fairness, I believe in being inclusive. Do I have bias? Yes, I absolutely do have bias, and I'm still a pretty good person, I think. Some of the biased language that's been used against me, I've been referred to as incompetent just because of the color of my skin, and not because individuals have had an opportunity or taken the opportunity to get to know me or think or see how I've contributed to this world. I've also been referred to as an angry Black woman, and social injustices that I've confronted in my life and that I continue to confront on a regular basis are racism, colorism, and sexism. So this is who I am. This is the core of me. This is how I'm showing up in this space with you today. This is the lens through which I see the world and the lens through which I problem solve. This is my selfie. And I'm sharing this with you because if we're going to become equity minded, it's going to be so important that you know the individual identities of your students as well as their cultural identities. We need to get to know our students on a much deeper level. We need to have conversations with them about their identities. We need to ask questions on a regular basis. So when I shared my identities, I talked about some that I was very privileged in and some that I've been oppressed in. And when we talk about privilege, this is a group of unearned cultural, legal, societal, and institutional rights extended to a particular group of people, right? It provides them with certain advantages. It becomes what's normalized in our society. And when I talk about oppression, I'm talking about this system of discrimination and personal bias and bigotry and social prejudice that exists against certain groups of people. Today, I'm going to ask us to have a bit of a conversation. And I have a few agreements that I hope all of us can follow today. One is stay engaged with the conversation. Speak your truth. Sometimes we don't speak our truth because we're afraid of offending another person. Experience discomfort. I'm going to share some data with you all today that might make you a bit uncomfortable. Experience that discomfort, embrace that discomfort, because that's truly when learning is triggered. We are not going to become equity experts today. We're not going to address all of the educational inequities that exist today. So expect and accept that non-closure. While all of you all are experts in your respective roles and fields, I also ask you today to show up as a learner and think about how you're going to take this information and apply it to your professional lives as well as your personal lives. I hope that this is a safe space for you and that you're brave enough to actually speak and you can share some of your thoughts and perspectives. And finally, I'm going to ask that you allow for growth and evolution in your understanding. And with that, let's kind of start our first conversation. This is more of a chat conversation, but I would love to know who's in this space with us today. And please, in the chat, go ahead and share maybe 2 or 3 aspects of your identity. Let us know who you are. And we need to get in a space where we're comfortable enough to share ourselves, right? Especially if we want to get to know our students on that much deeper level. So go ahead, just put in the chat some of your different identities so everyone can know who's in the space with them today. And this is where I'm talking about establishing a brave space, right? Because this is information that we typically don't share about who we are, but it's important that we do, especially for our students. All right, we have bisexual, Buddhist, complex PTSD, severe processing disorder. We have Black women, 36, living with anxiety and asthma. So you see, we have some diversity right here with us. We have an able-bodied, typically emotionally well, Latin man, cisgender presenting, but identify as genderqueer. So again, more diversity. Do you know how your students identify? We have a white woman, 73 years old, Christian, disabled, and confined to a wheelchair. Again, so many different aspects of identities, and diversity here is so important that we ask our students these questions, find out who they are, but at the same time, be willing to share who we are with them. So thank you all for engaging with that. So again, kind of going back to this sort of oppression. Oppression is very complex, and it happens on, different levels. It happens on that individual level. This might be kind of like color blindness when we say to individuals, well, I don't see color. I consider us all humans. And what you're doing with that is you're making people invisible, right? Or it can be on the sort of institutional level. And if we think about the institutional level, if we think about our educational institutions, students of color specifically are more likely to be concentrated in low-income schools with less qualified teachers, fewer resources, larger class sizes, and lower expectations. And then if we think about oppression on a broader societal level, think about how historically education has been funded here in the state of Illinois, and really in most states across the nation. It's been funded based on property taxes. So if you live in a poorer community where property taxes are less, those schools were getting fewer resources compared to living in a wealthier community where property taxes are more, and those schools were getting more resources, more funding, right? Oppression happens on a very unconscious level as well as a conscious level. So some people aren't even aware that they're oppressing another, but we need to raise our consciousness. We need to become a lot more aware. And oppression also impacts not only behaviors, but also attitudes as well. Let me show a quick video so you can kind of see some examples of how oppression shows up in education. right, so what does this video, what did it say to you? What are your thoughts right now?
I know for me, it says everything. I mean, it really outlined the struggle that different communities face. And I just really like the analogy and how it all put it all together and demonstrated, especially how the generational wealth and the disparities in that are really interconnected and really do outline the outcomes for people in marginalized communities.
Thank you, thank you. There's so many different social factors that negatively impact the educational experiences of certain groups. And those groups, right? And it's important that we name the groups where we see the most educational inequities are Black and Latinx students, students from lower socioeconomic communities, as well as students who have disabilities and students who are part of the LGBTQIA plus community. As a matter of fact, these students have been labeled, they've been labeled in the professional literature, they've been labeled within educational institutions as low achieving, disadvantaged, and struggling. If we take a look at the actual state of Illinois report card, and this is data from 2019, like take a look, what is this data really saying to you? If you look at who's been deemed proficient in math, you see Black, Hispanic, and low-income students who have the lowest proficiency. When you look at chronic absenteeism, all right, 31% of Blacks are chronically absent. Why? Our last president, Dr. Torres, actually said when he worked at U46 that he went to all of the students' homes who have been chronically absent to find out what was going on. And many of them said, this is the first time that anyone has ever asked me that question, that anyone has ever really shared that they were concerned about my well-being. And what he found is that many of those students, they just had home situations that they had to deal with, or they weren't necessarily being treated well at school. All right, so it's important that we find out what's happening and not make assumptions. When we look at the dropout rate, you see higher dropout rates with American Indian, Black students, as well as low-income students. And then when you look at students who are actually enrolled in, gifted and talented programs, the largest group are Asian students. The smallest groups are Black and Hispanic students. And then if you look at students who's graduating or who's not graduating after 4 years, you have American Indian, Black students, low income, and students with IAPs with the lowest graduation rates after 4 years, right? So it's definitely some clear inequities that exist. Now, all of us have been in this pandemic for 2 years now, right? And a lot had to change. We had to go from in-person learning to virtual learning, and we had to do so rather quickly, and we didn't necessarily have all the tools and resources to put it in place initially. Well, COVID-19 has definitely had an impact and has definitely widened the gap when it comes to educational inequities. If you see here, Black, Hispanic, low income, and English language learners, it's going to take them more time to actually recover from the impact of COVID-19 on education than with any other group, right? So there were already these sort of educational inequities, and now with the impact of COVID, those inequities, it's greater. Now, part of these inequities is a result of racial bias in schools. And I shared this a little bit earlier, but students of color are significantly more likely to be concentrated in low-income schools with less qualified teachers, fewer material resources, larger class sizes, and lower long-term expectations for their students. That's our reality right now. Because of these inequities, Black and Latinx students specifically have been labeled, right? And this is a very deficit-minded sort of perspective, but they've been labeled as dumb, dangerous, deprived, deviant, and disturbed. So these students walk into the classroom having these labels placed upon them, and it's a bias that teachers actually have. And what we know about bias is that when teachers already have a negative perspective about who their students are and the capabilities of their students, they're gonna have lower expectations. Teacher belief in their students' academic skills and potential is a vital ingredient for student success, right? When teachers underestimate their students, it affects not just the student-teacher relationship, but the student's entire self-concept. So there are also other factors as to why these educational inequities that exist. And this is on a much more systemic level. Teacher bias is on a very individual level, but these other issues are systemic in nature. It's disparities in students' exposure to racial, ethnic, and economic segregation. It's disparities in access to high quality pre-K programs. It's disparities in access to effective teaching. It's disparities in access and enrollment in rigorous coursework. It's disparities in cultural curricular breadth. It's disparities in access to high quality academic supports. It's disparities in school climate. It's disparities in non-exclusionary discipline practices, and it's disparities in non-academic supports for student success. We have to be willing to explore each one of these indicators. We need to measure where we are and begin to put interventions in place to combat these issues. And then when you look at sort of this gap amongst advanced learners, when we look at the excellence gap, we see the same sort of trends. And this purple line here, that's for our Asian students. So you can see when it comes to math, grade 4 and grade 8, our Asian students are outperforming all other populations. You know, then followed by our white students. Our Hispanic and our Black students are the lowest performing when it comes to mathematics. We see the same sort of trend when it comes to reading, right? Now by grade 8, the gap actually lessens, but you still have white and Asian students who are further ahead than Black and Hispanic students. This has resulted in sort of racial identity conflict with Black and Latinx students. Sometimes when Black and Latinx students are actually achieving and they're progressing well in their academics, they're accused of acting white. Because see, in our society, what's put forth as people who are quote unquote intelligent are Asian or white. So Black and Latinx students, when they're doing well, they get this label. It's caused Black and Latinx students to sometimes hide their talent, all right? Because they don't want to be labeled as acting white, a culture that they are not part of. They want to be seen as themselves. There's actually this situation, it was Black student, and this was when the real baggy jeans were in and hoodies. Well, this student had a baggy jeans on, his hoodie, he's in the lunchroom and he's hanging out with his friends and just rapping and sharing a bit of knowledge, right? Well, this student was on the debate team. And after school, he gets on the bus to go to his debate competition. And he takes off the baggy jeans and the hoodie, and underneath, he had on slacks and a nice shirt. He didn't want to be accused of acting white, so he hid that. How many of your students are hiding their talent and their potential because of this racial identity conflict? We see the same sort of excellence gap when it comes to economics, right? Students who are on free and reduced lunch are not performing as well, or not performing as well as those who are not on free and reduced lunch. We see this trend in math. We also see this same trend in reading. All right, now again, the gap lessens by the time 8th grade occurs, but it still exists. So why does this excellence gap exist? There's been inadequate training for educators. We have this exclusive use of using standardized tests, right? And our standardized tests aren't even focused on problem solving or critical thinking skills. We have systemic bias in the design of programs for advanced learners. We have these sort of attitudes about who is actually capable, right? And because of those labels that I mentioned earlier, people see Black and Latinx students, as well as students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, as not as capable as other students. There's a disparity in parents' awareness on advanced programs. We have under-resourced schools. We have fewer opportunities that actually enhance intellectual achievement. So many systemic problems that we need to address that we haven't been as an educational institution. You need to know who your students are. Those labels, that's exactly what they are. They're stereotypical labels. They're not the truth. So this is actually a chart of characteristics of advanced learners from CLED backgrounds. See, our Black students, they're intuitive, resourceful problem solvers. That's how we need to see them. Our Hispanic students, right? They learn to speak a second language very quickly. They're highly curious and eager to delve into new ideas in either language. Our students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, they have a wide range of interests. They're specifically talented when it comes to memory and knowledge. They're creative. So all of those sort of stereotypical perspectives that we've read about in the professional literature, you need to understand that that is deficit thinking. It's a very skewed perspective, and we need to see our students and their talents. We need to fully see them for who they are. We have to begin focusing on educational equity. And that's when educational policies, practices, interactions, and resources are representative of, constructed by, and responsive to all people, such that each individual has access to, can participate in, and make progress in high quality learning experiences that empower them towards self-determination and reduces disparities in outcomes, regardless of individual characteristics and cultural identities. Educational equity means access. So let me give you an example. We have peer tutors, and few years ago, my Black and Latinx students, they came to me and they had some concern with our program. And we said, well, we have this great program, right? Where you can get assistance, you can get tutoring. Well, my Black and Latinx students, they said, well, when we go to some of the peer tutors, they make us feel dumb. And they ask us, well, why don't you know this information already? They said sometimes they just want to tell us, you know, the answer, and we really want to learn the information. So while we provided this great resource, this great support, it wasn't necessarily accessible to all students, specifically in this case, the Black and Latinx students. Now, we've since created a new program in which Black and Latinx alum are serving as tutors and mentors for our Black and Latinx students. But I say all of this to say, just because you have a program, you have a resource, you have a support, it doesn't mean that it's accessible for the groups who need it the most. There needs to be representation, and that's representation in our practices, that's representation in curriculum, that's representation in the walls of a building. There needs to be meaningful participation in which we're centering the voices of students who've been historically marginalized. We understand their needs and provide very specific targeted supports. There needs to be high outcomes. A lot of times when people think when we're beginning to talk about equity, we're talking about lowering our standards. No, we want high standards. We're gonna have high expectations. What we have to ask ourselves is, what are we going to do to make sure that our students actually achieve? So we've been operating historically in a sort of deficit-minded perspective, where we're not really focused on our students. We label them as, oh, underprepared or developmental or urban. And we say we have to prepare them and we're just gonna offer these tutoring sort of services. Later on, we started sort of this diversity-minded perspective, and we're focused on inclusion and belonging and celebrating all of these different cultures, right? And not that there's anything wrong with that, that's important, but that doesn't address educational inequities that exist. We have to become more equity-minded. We have to name the groups who've been historically marginalized: Latinx, Black students, students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, right? We have to identify the actual gaps that exist. And we can only do that by looking at our data in a disaggregated way. We have to focus on culturally inclusive and culturally responsive practices. We need to critically examine our practices to make sure that students who've been historically marginalized are being served equitably. We have to begin to talk about our students in an equity-minded way. So it's a couple of statements here. I want you all to put in the chat whether or not you think it's equity-minded or deficit-minded. So we're gonna start with number 2. There are fewer Black students who graduate after 5 years because they aren't educationally prepared in the same way others are. There's very little that we can do. Equity or deficit-minded? Deficit, definitely deficit-minded. So how do we change this statement to become more equity-minded? Any thoughts?
Maybe speak facts and not perspectives.
Yeah, definitely speak facts. Our data shows that there are fewer Black students who graduate after 5 years. It is our responsibility to dig deeper and to get a better understanding as to why these inequities exist.
When you go as far as, and there's nothing we can do about that, that's one person's opinion. And so sometimes we have to, although we think differently, again, if you can stick to facts, just makes the world a difference in a statement.
Yeah, and as educators, we should never say there is very little we can do. We need to look internally at ourselves and say, what is it that I'm not doing that is contributing to these inequities? See, we sometimes have a tendency to blame the student instead of looking internally at ourselves. If our students fail, we fail. That's our failure.
Adrienne,
Yes.
Adrienne, this is Margie Lugman. One thing I thought it was to take a good look at our curriculum. I think our curriculum is very white oriented. That
Yes,
sometimes you can give a, let's say, a Black student a story problem that can be very white, but if it spoke more to their culture, they would probably get the answer. But I think, you know, social studies, math, all this is a very much white curriculum. And it's not that they can't do it, it's not their experience. But if we put the experience into the curriculum, I think you see them blossom.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that, Margie, and thanks for coming. And you're absolutely right. We have to be more culturally responsive, but that's why it's important to know who your students are and their identities, right? Just how we started off our webinar today. You need to understand who's in your classroom and put their lived experiences into the curriculum, especially if we want them to see themselves as part of their own educational experience. It's so very important. All right, so we don't have a lot of time today, but be very mindful about how you're talking about your students. Are you talking about them in a deficit-minded way or an equity-minded way? We also need to be mindful of the conversations that we're having with students and how we're asking them questions and making sure that we're student-centered. What else do you want to learn? Who can you ask for honest feedback? What's the next challenge to tackle? Are you proud of the end result? What can you learn from this experience or mistake? Leave our questions very open-ended, allowing students to really share their experiences without judgment.
So can I share a story, Adrienne, about something that happened this week to me?
Definitely.
So I had a student, he's a junior, come to my office and he writes. So he asked me if I would read like a paragraph from a story that he wrote. And I was in like 2 sentences in, I was into the story. So I was like, well, I thought this is funny, this is great. And I said, you're just a really, really good writer. And he said, I appreciate that. So he says, can you do me a favor? And he said, can you look at a comment from this teacher? So the teacher was basically asking him, it was like a grammar type of situation, which, like I said, I read it. And this is this Black student, and I totally understood everything he was saying. And so the student was struggling because he had to explain a phrase that he was using to a teacher. And I said, no. I said, you're just gonna have to explain it to him. And he said, well, why do I always feel like I'm having to do this? You know, why am I always having to? And I said, well, what you don't understand is actually this is probably a teachable moment for the teacher, because he's asking you, he's saying to you, well, shouldn't you be saying this? You're spelling this way. And I said, you're going to have to say to him, actually, no, this is the way that the person was saying it, because, you know, this person has this background, and in this environment, this is kind of the way that somebody is explaining something. I said, I know it sounds like, you know, like you said, you're tired of explaining things, but you're going to have to make the teacher understand that in different spaces and in different environments, people just talk different. It's not that you're saying anything right or wrong. It's just, you know, he was saying the grandmother in the character in the story was a grandmother, and she was saying something like, instead of her saying, you better not go outside, it was like, bet not. And we laughed. When I read it, I laughed. I thought it was hilarious. Because he was kind of using this language the way that his grandmother speaks. But the teacher was like, you know, what is this? What do you mean? And he was saying how it made him feel like he couldn't express himself in this story, because he really wanted it to reflect, you know, the way that this character was speaking. And he was getting tired of having to, and I said, no, I said, this is the moment where you have to say, the reason that I'm doing this is because this is my experience. You're asking me to write my story, but yet you're not letting me speak in a way that, I mean, if it's my story, it's my story. And so he went away feeling a lot better about it. But that's just one instance where, you know, we have to be willing to learn about one another, because just because you think that something should be said in a certain way because maybe your grandmother or your grandparent may say it in one way, well, that doesn't mean that that's the way it is over here. And nothing's wrong with either one of them. They're just different.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Ange. And quite honestly, it should never be the student's responsibility to teach the actual educator. It should be the responsibility of the educator to understand the language that's being used amongst the students in the class. That's so very important.
I totally agree, but I felt that he needed to respond, because he didn't want to respond to the teacher. He just didn't want to respond. And I said, I think that you have to, you know, because
no, I think you gave him great advice considering the situation.
Right.
But thinking about educators, we need to understand who our students are culturally. And if we understand who our students are culturally, then we would have understood what the student was saying. And that's a huge problem. And we're so focused on being grammatically correct that you don't allow students to sometimes, just sometimes, it doesn't have to be all the time, but sometimes communicate in the language that is most familiar to them. All right, so if I'm talking to a group of educators, if you want to be culturally responsive, then you need to learn and understand the different cultures that exist and not depend on your students to actually teach you. Go and do your own research. Go and get your own understanding. There's so much information out there, and just a lot of times that's not happening.
Yeah, I just couldn't let him not respond. You know what I mean? Because like I said, you know, you're asking a student to write a story, and he is. And I told you, I read it, and I was taken in by the story, like 2-3 sentences in. And I totally understood it. And then when he pointed out, he said, now I want you to read, you know, what my teacher said to me. And I was like, wow, you know.
Yeah, and the reality is we have, this is our reality. Nearly 85% of teachers are white females. Most who have never received any sort of training or education on how to be culturally responsive or how to be culturally competent. They don't understand equity. It wasn't necessarily part of their educational experience. So what they have, what they know is what the literature has said. And most of the literature that's out there is from a very much deficit perspective.
Adrienne, it looks like Marjorie has her hand up and has a question. Marjorie, if you can just go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Sure. Just to give another perspective, I'll never forget when I sat with Paul and Regina and they spent a half hour talking about how Grandma made chitlins down in Mississippi. I had no idea what chitlins were, but can you imagine, so I had to learn what that was, but I couldn't join that conversation because I didn't have that knowledge from their culture. I wanted to ask you, Adrienne, to comment. I've been places where they've taken a Black or Hispanic student and put them in front of maybe kids from, lower level schools and said, if they can make it, so can you. But I've seen the children's faces drop because they have a big awareness that the odds of them being able to make it as the star they put up in front is very low. And
Well, I wouldn't necessarily read it that way. I would say Black and Latinx students know when they're being showcased.
okay.
Right. And this isn't necessarily because individuals are genuinely concerned about who I am and my academic success, but they want to show off that there's some diversity. They want to show off that we have, this Black or Latinx talent. Right. So I don't think it's necessarily about what the students feel that they're capable of achieving. I think that it's sometimes problematic with schools saying, well, we're going to show off these particular kids because these are our high flyers.
Right.
Also
yeah.
referred to as tokenism.
Yeah, and what pressure that must put on those kids. They can't
Well,
fail.
I don't even know if it's pressure. I think sometimes it's traumatic.
Yeah.
Because students want to know that they're genuinely cared about. And if all you're doing is showcasing me for some sort of gain, that's really problematic.
Yeah. No, I was at a meeting once and they said to me, we have to diversify, and some of those people, can you bring them to our meeting? Inside I thought, maybe I could get one of those old paddy wagons and throw them all in. But I did
Well,
say,
we don't want to get a paddy wagon. That sends a
another-
whole different message.
no,
now.
I'm just joking on that, Adrienne. But I said to them, don't you think they'll know that the only reason they're there is for diversity? And then I gave 5 names and I said, these people have names. And I was not invited back.
Hey, Adrienne,
Well,
can I share one more story and then I'll be quiet?
Sure.
So my son, he's in his 20s now, but when he was in high school, he was always the only one. Always the only, any course that's any AP, whatever, he was, there might have been 2 in his class, but he was always the only one. So I remember I want to say it was the first or second day, it was at least the first week of school. And they took a quick little quiz, kind of see where the kids were in the class. And so somebody got like a 97 or 98. This was like AP Calc or something, I don't know. And somebody in the class got a 97 or 98. And everybody was blown away. Everybody was trying to figure out who got this 97 or 98. And they're all the kids are like running around the class. They're trying to figure out who got the 97, 98. But the one person that was in the class that they didn't go to got the 97 and 98. And that was my son. And that was because nobody expected it. That's just, it's a label type, oh, he's just here because whatever. But it was him. So the teacher didn't even point out, he just kind of let it, the teacher knew who it was, but the teacher just said, wow, there's somebody in here that's doing really well. He did this on the first week of school, whatever, he got this 90, whatever. But here we are, it's the same unfortunate story that so many students have to to deal with.
Yeah, that's why we have to see our students, especially our Black and Latinx students, in a different light. That narrative, that stereotypical narrative that is constantly being played, right, in our different experiences, we need to counter that narrative. We need to see students for who they are. And Black and Latinx students are bright, brilliant, creative, imaginative, students. And we need to see that and honor that and believe that. We also need to recognize our bias. There is definitely bias that exists within education. There's bias in grading. There's bias when it comes to who's disciplined and who's not. There's bias when it comes to providing feedback to students. We need to be able to respond to that bias, redress that bias, and create a bias-free environment, right? Understand that inequities are operating right now in their spheres of influence and proactively advocate for the institutional change necessary to eliminate them at their roots, rather than waiting for individual people to report and then episodically responding to those individual manifestations of that inequity. We need to be proactive, not reactive, basically. We need to give students, not give them the same thing. That's what equality is. We need to give them what they need to be successful. In this first frame, everybody's at the mountaintop, but everyone can't see the mountaintop. In the second frame, and the first frame, that's equality. In the second frame, we've given people what they needed so that they can see the mountaintop. That's equity. And the more that we work towards advancing equity, we'll get to this third frame in which those barriers don't exist. In order to do that, we need to directly confront equity or inequities that exist. We need to honor that there is a system of racism, a system of classism that has negatively impacted certain groups of people. We need to prioritize and center the voices of those communities who've been marginalized. We need to look internally at ourselves and fix the actual injustice. So all of those different injustices that you saw in that video, we need to fix those and stop blaming the students, stop pointing our fingers at the students. We don't need to fix the kids. The kids are fine. And we need to understand that one size fits few. So you have to differentiate. We need to be willing to look at our students and their outcomes and disparities at all levels, right? And disaggregate that data by race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status. We need to recognize that these biases exist, stereotypes, there's discrimination in educational institutions. We need to recognize all of that. We need to own it and acknowledge that. We so often, educational institutions only want to focus on what they're doing well. We're going to highlight everything that we're doing great, but we're not going to discuss our problems. We're going to keep these under wrap. No, you need to put the problems in the forefront, and we need to specifically begin to work on them. We need to begin to look at all of our policies, practices, resources, and services through an equity lens. The Portland Public Schools equity, Portland Public Schools, they have this equity lens that I think is very effective, and it allows you to really take a look at those policies and practices to make sure that you're centering the voices of those who've been historically marginalized, that you're specifically addressing the inequities that exist. So these are a couple of tools that can be used. the Multnomah County, they have one as well. What is positively and negatively impacted? Who's positively and negatively impacted? What sort of positive things are actually in place? How are we meaningfully including those marginalized groups, and what are the barriers? So we need to look at every single thing that we're doing through this lens of equity. So today, I know you all must be awake because you actually decided to attend this webinar. I'm hoping that as you looked at the actual inequities that exist in our educational institutions, that you become a little bit more woke. And now it's time to work. Your whole structure must be changed. A nation that will keep people in slavery for 244 years will thingify them, make them things. Therefore, they will exploit them and poor people generally, economically. And a nation that will exploit economically will have to have foreign investments and everything else, and will have to use its military might to protect them. All of these problems are tied together. What I am saying today is that we must go from this conversation and say, education, you must be born again. Let us be dissatisfied until America will no longer have a high blood pressure of creeds and an anemia of deeds. Let us be dissatisfied until the tragic walls that separate the outer city of wealth and comfort and the inner city of poverty and despair shall be crushed by the battering rams of the forces of justice. Let us be dissatisfied until those that live on the outskirts of hopes are brought into the metropolis of daily security. Let us be dissatisfied until slums are cast into the junk heaps of history and every family is living in a decent home. Let us be dissatisfied until the dark yesterdays of segregated schools will be transformed into bright tomorrows of quality education. Let us be dissatisfied until integration is not seen as a problem, but as an opportunity to participate in the beauty of diversity and equity. Let us be dissatisfied until men and women, however Black they may be, will be judged on the basis of the content of their character and not on the basis of the color of their skin. Let us be dissatisfied until every state capital houses a governor who will do justice, who will love mercy, and who will walk humbly. Let us be dissatisfied until from every city hall, justice will run down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Let us be dissatisfied until that day when the lion and the lamb shall lie together and every person will sit under their own vine and fig tree and none shall be afraid. I must confess, my friends, the road ahead will not always be smooth. There will still be rocky places of frustration and meandering points of bewilderment. There will be inevitable setbacks here and there. There will be those moments when the buoyancy of hope will be transformed into the fatigue of despair. Our dreams will sometimes be shattered and our hopes blasted. We may be, again, with tear-drenched eyes, have to stand before the bearer of some courageous civil rights worker whose life will be snuffed out by the acts of bloodthirsty mobs. Difficult and painful as it is, we must walk on the days ahead with an audacious faith in the future. In the words of Dr. Martin Luther King. Thank you. And I hope that you all will tune in for part 2 coming Tuesday, April 5th, 2022 at 3:30. And if there are any questions right now, I know we're a few minutes past our time, but I'm happy to address any questions or hear any sort of comments or thoughts that you may have.
I just want to say thank you, Adrienne, and I did learn things today, so thank you very much.
Well, you're welcome, and thanks so much for coming, Margie. All right, so this was the first part in a 3-part series. I shared with you the next date is April 5th. We'll have another date in May, and I hope that you all come back, and next time bring some educators with you, bring some friends, bring some administrators. Share the knowledge. Thanks so much, you all.